Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Mercenary Guide for Rome Total War. This is a video I've wanted to do for a long time where I basically go through all the mercenaries in the game and discuss them, compare them, and it's actually quite interesting because some of the mercenaries in Rome Total War, well, first of all, there's actually quite a sort of range of ability of mercenaries, but secondly, some of them are very similar. For example, Illyrian mercenaries and mercenary peltasts. Two very similar units, but actually this kind of video we should be able to differentiate these sort of differences between them. And I'm going to discuss mercenaries in general. Now, I actually consider myself to be a bit of an expert on mercenaries. My first ever campaign on YouTube was a mercenary only challenge. I completed Rome Total War as Egypt, but only using mercenaries. It's an old series on the channel, but yes, I actually have used quite a lot of mercenaries, particularly in that campaign. I'm actually going to split this into three parts because there are sort of three regions in the game, three sort of mercenary pools where you're going to find specific groups of mercenaries. You're going to have the sort of barbarian regions, you're then going to have the sort of mercenaries that you'll find in the Mediterranean, the Roman regions, the Greek regions, the Macedonian regions, and then further south you're going to have the region where you find mercenaries in Egypt, and the Middle East and just generally across North Africa and Numidia. So today we're just going to be specifically focusing on the Barbarian mercenaries, probably the weakest, honestly, of the three mercenary pools. So yeah, specifically about the Barbarian mercenaries today. Let's go. The ones at the north of the map, honestly, are probably the weakest. It's the weakest pool of mercenaries. There's a few good cavalry mercenaries which we'll discuss. There's the odd good unit, but in general, this is sort of where the weaklings lie. And we're going to start off with the weakest of the weaklings, the Barbarian mercenaries. You'll find them particularly in Gaul and yeah, like sort of that Germania, Gaul, Central European and Northern European region. Not particularly amazing. Honestly, these guys are only a small step above peasants. I mean, they're a decent step above. Peasants have like a sort of attack of 3, defense of 4, something like that. Barbarian mercenaries, obviously, these stats kind of depend on what level they are because sometimes they have a bit of experience, but in general, they have an attack of 7 and a defense of 10. Not terrible, not amazing either. If you have a look at their abilities, they may charge without orders, so they're a little bit of an unruly bunch, which again is not something I like. I like the nice sort of structure and order to my army in general, although if you see my videos, you know all structure and everything goes to hell pretty quickly. But still, if an enemy is just charging randomly, that's not great. But saying that, if you're in these kind of regions anyway, you're probably playing as rebels or barbarians, and you've probably got several units that are going to do exactly the same. But anyway, let's get back on track. Barbarian mercenaries, very basic unit, and actually very expensive for what they are. Recruitment cost 800. That's quite expensive. If you think of what other units you can get for 800, you can get 2 units of something much better for 800. You know, really, I would only use these guys if you're desperate, if you need a unit to carry a ram, for example. Let's say you're playing as Scythia, and this is something I did plenty of times in my Scythia campaign, had full cavalry armies and forgot to have a geezer to bring the ram. Well, then I would hire a barbarian mercenary, but still, £800 for basically a ram carrier, not great. Now, they do have the advantage of the war cry, which is pretty cool, so definitely use that, particularly in a tricky situation. That can improve the morale if things are looking a little bit dicey, and they're quite good in the sort of woods and snow, hiding and a combat bonus, and again, that's where you're going to be using these guys because that's where they're available. Not terrible, but light weaponry, not very good armor. Yeah, I mean, barbarian mercenaries have never served me that well, and they tend to break down in terms of morale pretty quickly, so not a terrible unit, but definitely could be better. Then we get on to Barbarian Cavalry mercenaries, attack of 7, defense of 10, charge bonus of 7. Now these guys are light cavalry, so they're quick on their feet, not particularly good for that really impactful charge, although 7 charge bonus actually isn't too terrible for light cavalry if I am not mistaken. And again, 800 denarii, but these guys are much better value for money in my opinion. As it says there, fast moving at the abilities at a glance, and that means really they're going to be good at chasing troops down at the end of the battle, flanking if you quickly need a unit of cavalry around the back or the side of a unit, particularly if you're sort of in a sort of one-on-one struggle between 2 units and you need that sort of just quick charge in the side. You need a unit of cavalry to get there quickly and help support. These guys can do a pretty good job. Again, in my opinion, not worth 800 denarii and 100 upkeep. In fact, the upkeep is half of what the barbarian mercenaries are, which is interesting really, because if you think These guys have a horse and they're less upkeep. I don't know how that works, but anyway, that's how it works apparently. And yet, not a terrible unit. You're not going to get a lot of decent cavalry in this kind of region, particularly if you're playing as factions like Germania or Gaul. In the early game, not a lot of amazing light cavalry. These guys can just sort of help pick up the support. Now, if you're playing as something like Scythia, completely pointless having these guys because you've got an abundance of cavalry. But maybe some of the other barbarian factions, Dacia, for example, would probably be a better example. Yeah, maybe these guys could be useful as an extra backup, but only if you've got an abundance of cash, because 800 denarii, for me, is not worth it. But yeah, that's my opinion on Barbarian Cavalry Mercenaries. Next up, my favourite, Scythian Mercenaries. Big fan of Scythian Mercenaries. In fact, they're not a perfect unit, and I am going to discuss why in a second. But for 800 denarii, personally, I think they are much better value for money than the previous unit that we just looked at. Now, as you can probably guess by the picture, Scythian Mercenaries are light cavalry, but they are missile cavalry. They have a bow and arrow, and that's really cool. Their missile attack is 8, pretty solid, not amazing. Again, a standard unit of early game Scythian cavalry, which is pretty cool. Their melee attack and defense is only 4 and 3. Not good at all. These guys will not survive long in the melee, but they're skirmishers. That's not their job. If you are using these guys to fight in the melee, you've probably lost the battle already because you're on your last legs. But what these guys will do, and they're incredibly annoying if you've played as a faction like Thrace, for example, and you've had to face the Scythians, these units are very, very tricky to deal with because they will just skirmish around you. They're so fast that you cannot even dream of hitting them, and they can hit you for ages until they run out of arrows. A very annoying unit to deal with, but a very overpowered unit if you've got them in your arsenal. Now, the only thing I will say about Scythian Mercenaries, first of all, they don't pack a huge punch, which we've discussed already, but second of all, in a lot of circumstances, actually, you're not going to really need them. If you're playing a Scythia, you've got an abundance of Scythian horse archers that you can recruit anyway for a cheaper price, so there's no point really buying mercenaries unless you're really desperate or you've got a lot of money. Really, if you're playing a Scythia, not much need for these guys. And if you're playing as another faction, well, these guys aren't available all over the map. If you're playing in Gaul, for example, you're not going to be able to get Scythian mercenaries, even though they're sort of the more barbarian style mercenaries. They're sort of fixed to the sort of Scythia, what you would call sort of Russia, Ukraine region nowadays. And that means really, unless you're attacking the Scythians, you're probably not going to be in a position where you're going to need these guys or be in a situation where you can recruit them. So their usefulness is somewhat diminished by the fact that the only faction that's really going to use them a lot, and being the region where they can use them on a regular basis, is Scythia, and they already have this unit anyway. That's the only thing I would say about them. But again, if you need an extra horse archer, if you just need a sort of nice overpowered unit, then definitely just hop up into the Scythian sort of zone and pick up these guys. I do recommend them. You've got to use them right. You've got to either use skirmish mode, although that can be very unreliable if you've seen my Scythian campaign before, but make sure you're just keeping these guys away from the units you're attacking so they can get lots of hits in, but they won't get hit themselves. But yeah, Scythian Mercenaries, I'm a big fan of indeed. And then continuing with cavalry, I think this is pretty much all there is in terms of cavalry in the Barbarian region. Sarmatian Mercenaries, a very, very interesting unit. Now, I've had a bit of a mixed time with Sarmatian Mercenaries, honestly, because I have in previous campaigns struggled with them a bit. I found that they've gone down pretty quickly, but their stats are pretty damn good. Now, maybe it's just that I was using them incorrectly, but on paper, these guys are pretty damn good, and I think if you use them effectively, they can be a very good unit indeed. 1,200 denarii, which is quite a lot of money, but if you consider the amounts we were discussing before, for example, 800 for just normal barbarian footmen, actually an extra 400 denarii for a really quite solid unit of heavy cavalry isn't that much comparatively to the rest of the mercenaries. So, like I said, 1,200 denarii, 54 soldiers, so a decent amount of men in a unit. 8 attack is okay, nothing amazing, but a 10 charge bonus, heavy weapon type means they can really pack a bit of a punch in if you charge them with effectiveness. So that's quite cool. Total defense 13, nothing amazing, but solid, and we'll talk about the defense in a second. What I think is really cool about these guys is good morale. Morale is so important in Rome Total War, and mercenaries tend to not have great morale in general. You've got to remember, these guys are fighting for money, not really for pride. But this is a rare example of a unit that has good morale as a mercenary, and that means that they're really quite a good pickup. What I would say about Sarmatian Mercenaries is I think they are quite good as to be used as sort of like a shock unit. A unit where in the heat of the battle, where things are sort of balancing on a knife edge and you need that one big heavy bam charge in from a unit of heavy cavalry, well, Sarmatian Mercenaries can do exactly that because of their powerful charge, like it says at their abilities. The charge bones are 10. The fact that they can just pack a punch, you can see they've got those long sort of spears that they're carrying, and a charge into the side or back of a unit can make the difference between them sort of wavering and getting some kills to just completely broken. Now, for me, I don't like using Sarmatian Mercenaries in a sort of long slugging match because their defense isn't hugely high. There is better cavalry in the game to do that, but as a sort of shock unit, impact unit that can turn the tide of a battle, this is quite a good pickup indeed. So definitely would recommend Sarmatian Mercenaries if you're going to use them properly, but not particularly fast. Yeah, quite powerful, and their upkeep's only 170. If you consider again, we looked at the first unit, and this really makes me realise how bad Barbarian Mercenaries are. They were 200 upkeep. So, you know, I mean, this is much better value for money in my opinion, even though it's quite expensive. And again, like I said, in this region, apart from if you're Scythia, but even if you are Scythia, you don't have a lot of heavy cavalry. A lot of the factions in this region don't have a lot of heavy cavalry, and to pick up a unit of Sarmatian Mercenaries can give you a massive comparative advantage over your sort of rival factions and give you that extra boost you need. So I do recommend Sarmatian Mercenaries. I do like them quite a lot. And the last unit in the sort of Barbarian region, the sort of northern central region of the map, or really actually in the Iberian part of the map in this instance, is Spanish Mercenaries. Now I would say actually out of all the mercenary units, this is probably the one I have the least experience with, because I haven't really played as Spain a huge amount of times, and it's not really an area I ever attack. I always think attacking Spain is a bit pointless, really, because it's actually quite a large area for not a lot of reward. The settlements aren't particularly lucrative, and they're spaced out a surprising amount through mountains. It's an annoying region to get through. I don't like fighting the Spanish. But anyway, Spanish Mercenaries, if you are going to fight the Spanish, are pretty decent indeed. If you have a look at these Spanish Mercenaries, 750 denarii, again, comparing to what we've already seen, best value for money so far, cheaper than all the other units, and significantly better than Barbarian Mercenaries. They are a mix of sort of melee and missile. They are a missile unit, but they've got a solid melee attack of 7 as well, and a solid defense of 12. 7 and 12 for a javelin unit, not too bad. It means that if they do run out of javelins, they're not completely useless. It means if they do get exposed in the heat of battle and they have to fight in melee, they can hold their ground a little bit because they have that heavy weapon type and they have a decent amount of armor, so not a bad unit at all. Their missile attack is 11, again, pretty solid for a javelin unit. They're not going to fire far like archers will, but actually, in terms of javelin men in this region, pretty much the best you're going to get. And we're going to be looking at some javelin men a bit later as well. In fact, we'll look at them just in a second. And it will be interesting to compare them. But certainly in this region of the map, in the west of the map, this is pretty much the best javelin man you're going to find. A solid and actually surprisingly versatile unit for a decent amount of money as well. 750 denarii is still quite a lot in my opinion, but actually value for money in terms of mercenaries, not too bad at all. And these guys, you're going to pick them up in a sort of Iberia region and the sort of islands that surround Spain. That's where you're going to find these guys, hence the name. Now, I understand I probably should include the Balearic slingers. Is it Balearic or Balearic? Whatever. I should include the slingers because technically they are found in the region around Spain and the islands around Spain, the Balearic Islands, believe it or not. But I'm actually going to leave that for next video because I want to specifically compare them to the Rhodian slingers. So, yes, the Balearic slingers should be here, but you're going to have to wait a little bit longer to see about them. So yeah, that's pretty much all for the Barbarian Mercenaries. Honestly, nothing amazing. Nothing hugely stands out. I think the best ones that we've discussed today are the Spanish Mercenaries and the Sarmatian Mercenaries. The Scythian Mercenaries are really, the Scythian Horse Archer Mercenaries are quite useful indeed. They are quite overpowered, but again, you know, I'm not really sure when you would recruit them because if you're Scythia, you can have these guys anyway, but still, they're a very cool unit. I do like them. But next time we'll be discussing the mercenaries in the sort of Mediterranean region, and they are definitely some of my favourites. There are some really, really cool units in there indeed. So make sure you're there for that. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with more videos very, very soon. See you around.